I want to get the show on the road. Gentlemen, I just want to make sure that you can hear me just fine. Drew, Pratik, once you guys can hear me, oh, cool. He's setting up the mic. We'll give him a minute here, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Hello.
Hey, what's going on, man?
Going well. Sorry about the little technical difficulties there.
No worries at all. We are live on YouTube, and I'm going to go ahead and start the Telegram recording. Good afternoon, Whale Coin Talk community. My name is Noah. I'm here today with Spanning Labs. Representing them are their two co-founders, Pratik and Drew. And gentlemen, before we get started, give us a quick background of who you are and how you got to find yourselves in the crypto industry.
Yeah. It's a similar story for both of us. So we first met each other at an internship working on self-driving cars about 5 years ago, actually. Spent all of our time over those 5 years working at Zook's, which is now Amazon's bet in the self-driving car space. Fast forward to around a year ago, Zook's got acquired by Amazon, or that was really a year and a half ago. Things started to change a little bit, slow down, get a little less exciting, a little less fun, and we were looking to make a change. We had both been following crypto at a high level for a really long time. I actually had a Kickstarter project in high school that turned into an e-commerce business, and I did accept Bitcoin as payment. One person took me up on that and used BitPay instead of PayPal, and took 14 days for the transaction to run, and then I took the payment option off the website. But that was a long time ago, and things have gotten a lot better. And then Pratik, I'll let him give some of his background. Yeah, he actually studied distributed computing.
Yeah, so. It's actually kind of a funny world. In school, I studied distributed computing and just generalized complex topologies. And something that I never really realized until I started working with Drew specifically on blockchain was that distributed systems and the way different computers interact with each other are the same between a number of different industries. It's the same in robotics, where Drew and I come from, but it's especially true in blockchain as well. And so being able to kind of see these parallels between the types of work we had done and the exciting industry that is Web3, it made perfect sense for us to jump right in and get building on Spanning.
Right. When we had made the decision to leave Zook and start our own thing. When we made the decision to leave Zook and start our own thing. I think we're running over each other a bit. I'll let you go.
Oh no, was that on my end?
Oh, it's some feedback. No worries. So when we made the decision to leave Zook's, we were looking at a whole ton of different industries, and the thing that really there were two things I think that really excited us about Web3 and blockchain. The first was we started reading all of these white papers, playing around with all of these projects, and seeing a tremendous amount of overlap between the skill sets we had and the algorithms and the problems and solutions we were seeing in robotics, and really specifically safety critical robotics, self-driving cars, rocket ships, and Web3, which excited us technically. And then the other thing that really excited me was every person you talked to was building something tremendous and trying to really change the world. It really feels like the internet is being rebuilt from scratch, from the ground up. And we've talked to people, taking on the new Web3 stock exchange or building the Web3 Netflix, and getting to be a part of that is very exciting.
Gentlemen, and Drew, I would hope you kept that Bitcoin that was paid to you through BitPay. I'm not sure if you're still hanging on to that, but before we get into the nuts and bolts of things, can you give us a high-level overview of what Spanning Labs is and how your cross-chain API helps change the way that we understand interoperability?
Yes. So we're big fans about interoperability, and we can get into kind of our vision of the world and what Web3 will look like a little bit later on in the talk, but we're definitely approaching the problem a little bit differently. So while we were jumping around looking at all of these different projects, playing with all of the new Olympus DAO clones that were coming out around last summer, every time we did so, we ran into a problem. We had to move tokens from one network to another, and it was a really awful experience. We were, you go, you wrap your tokens, then you pay some fee and give it to some custody agent, then you cross your fingers and wait 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes for it to pop up on another chain, and you go to claim your wrap tokens, only to realize you forgot to wrap and send over some gas tokens. So now you're going back to a centralized exchange, and an hour later, maybe we were using the applications we set out to use. So we were pretty upset with the state of interoperability as users. And the problem we attributed it to was everyone was approaching this problem from the idea of moving assets around. How do I get my value from Ethereum to Solana? But blockchains were really designed with this core tenet that assets are not composable between them. Ethereum only exists on Ethereum, and the second you move it off of Ethereum, it's a new asset. So we went back to the drawing board and we said, what is really composable between these blockchains? If we were to solve interoperability and really go after that seamless user experience that we have on Web 2, where it doesn't matter what internet service provider I use, I can get on this Telegram call. How do we get that same experience for Web 3? And what we found when we went back to kind of those first principles was users are composable between these blockchains. Every blockchain uses a public and private key encryption pair, generate an authorized signature that proves I'm the owner of something or proves that I'm the one running a certain transaction in my name. And if we could pass those signatures around, then we can get that more seamless interoperability where a developer can deploy their application once on a single network and a user never has to switch wallets or get new gas tokens, and can seamlessly use applications on other chains. And that concept is something we've been calling ownership bridging. So moving the users around rather than moving the applications or the value.
Got it. So that leads me into the next set of questions. The spanning delegate allows us to call a function of a contract on another chain. So essentially, instead of bridging over my Ethereum to Avalanche in order to stake it on Aave, I can just use Aave on Avalanche straight from the Ethereum mainnet?
Exactly. Right. So you get to pay with your preferred gas token. You get to keep everything in your one wallet. You never have to hit that switch network button on that MetaMask dropdown. And you can make those generic contract calls. So you can make a generic contract call to anything that exists today on the Avalanche network. Not everything supports multi-chain users yet. So Aave specifically wouldn't recognize that someone from Ethereum is trying to talk to it, and they might get confused and point themselves at the delegate contract unnecessarily. But that's what we're here to do. We're here to spread the gospel of multi-chain and get more people involved in making this easier for people to use and getting towards that mass adoption.
Yeah, and what Drew's kind of described here is what we think of as multi-home applications, for lack of a better term. And that's kind of the concept where the developer can deploy in the one spot that best suits their technical needs, whether that's the decentralization of somewhere like Ethereum or the rapid settlement times of somewhere else like Avalanche, while also letting the users pick where they want to deploy. And so by having both of these options, it really starts to look a little bit more like what we see in Web 2 as well, where you don't put everything in the whole world on Amazon AWS S3. You put some stuff on MongoDB, you put some stuff on this hosting provider, you use a certain technology because it's the right thing to use in a certain spot. And we want to bring that same ethos into Web3 as well. There are definitely better reasons to use Ethereum over Avalanche in certain conditions, and the vice versa is also true. And so we really want to allow these users and developers to optimize for what they want.
Pratik, Drew, I listened to another podcast or another AMA that you guys did, and I forget which one of you it was, used a great analogy, a great Web2 analogy that resonated with me a lot because I was also an AOL kid and I loved using AOL Instant Messenger. I would fight my parents about why I wanted to use that as an ISP, but you said basically the same thing is going to happen with Web3 as happened with Web2, where in Web2, we stopped caring so much about the ISP, or rather what applications the ISP that we use brought, more so the speed and the cost of it. And you said the same thing's going to happen with these chains, where you're going to have one chain that's like Ethereum, a main chain like Ethereum that's a bit more expensive, but that's the prestige, and certain projects are going to launch on that. And then other projects are going to choose to launch on Solana or AVAX because of low costs, or because that blockchain has faster transactions and it's better for video games. So with that said, and kind of what that leads me to is, why is it so important to have this sort of ecosystem as opposed to one where we're relying on interoperability through bridges? Let's say we have, for example, WBTC that's bridged through REN. Like, what are the downsides of that? What are the disadvantages of that?
Yeah, I think the big thing is custody. Or there's two big things. There's the user experience and there's custody. So first I'll talk about custody. And right now, when you have a wrapped token that's wrapped across these different networks, it doesn't matter how decentralized the solution is that you use to send that data. You know, it could be fully decentralized relay network, but you're still trusting somebody to custody the value of that wrapped token. And you're trusting them indefinitely. It's almost like it's 100% collateralized loan with no insurance. And it creates a really big risk for you that you have to have that trust, and also a really big target for attackers. So when you can go and you can drain the wormhole bridge in a single transaction and steal $400 million, you're gonna have a lot of people interested in that. And any security weaknesses you have are gonna be attacked at all times. If you switch to a model where you don't have that third-party custody and users can own these assets cross-chain directly in their name, that becomes much more expensive for attackers to target. And so on the spanning network, where you can have an ERC20 token that's owned by users directly across 10 different networks, an attacker can't run a single transaction to steal all of those assets. They have to run a transaction per user, per network, per application, or per in this case, there's just the one asset. But it gets combinatorially expensive for them to do so, and much more complex for them to do so. So getting rid of that third-party custody and getting rid of those large honeypots is something that's very important. And then the second big reason is the user experience. You know, if you're asking a user to switch networks, that's going to be prohibitive for mass adoption. And that's going to be prohibitive for a lot of users. Even if they are technical enough and they're okay navigating Web3 directly, it's still very cumbersome. It takes a long time. It's very expensive. You have to go out and you have to maintain your own personal treasuries of all of these different gas tokens and make sure they're topped off. And you know, when it takes someone 30 minutes just to start to use your application, you've already lost.
Yeah, and I think the last thing that I'll add here is kind of more from an ethos perspective as well. Web3 really prides itself on the composability of its various systems, and Drew and I hate to reinvent the wheel. And so when we see all of these cool projects on different chains, sure, we could copy and paste them, or the community could copy and paste them between these various chains. But I think it makes more sense just from the perspective of the industry that we just allow these applications to talk to each other directly. It doesn't necessarily even make sense in the long run for us to have 50 copies of every application just to be able to interact with it. And that's definitely the future that spanning is trying to introduce, such that we can just have one source of truth that really represents what a developer wants to show to the world and what users can interact with.
I know that you guys are still very early in your journey. And obviously, when we see stuff like the Ronin hack happen, we're like, all right, this is clearly a vulnerability and a problem that needs a solution. And I can see I can see Spanning Labs being the solution to that problem. I'm curious to know what you guys think the likelihood, though, of what you guys think the likelihood of a bridge like Ren or AVAX's bridge actually being compromised, and whether you think that your proprietary protocol or your code that you guys are designing will one day become mature enough to displace those bridges entirely.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple of different perspectives to have here on that. And the first that I'll start with is that our model is fundamentally different in terms of security than existing bridges. And so we offer a different set of guarantees than the bridges that you had described earlier. Because we use a centralized relayer while also distributing and decentralizing the assets themselves, we don't have the same risks that, as Drew mentioned, that things like Ronin and Ren have, where you have a massive honeypot. I think because of this kind of serves an auxiliary need. We see a lot of these different bridges focused very strongly on asset liquidity and moving assets around. And the spanning protocol allows us to be able to do that, but it's much, much more than that as well. It allows us to arbitrarily communicate data between these chains, which is the more general solution to these types of problems. And so we think that there may be still a place in the future for these chains that, these bridges that are hosted by chains and other institutions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't value in the spanning network. And in fact, it only increases the value of the spanning network as more chains are interacting with each other.
I couldn't agree more. Sorry, go ahead. I think Pratik or Drew wanted to speak there.
Oh, I was going to add, I don't want to comment on any specific bridges, and I haven't dove super deep into things like that, Avalanche's solution. But I can guarantee you that we will see more bridge hacks in general.
I couldn't agree more. And again, listening to your other AMA, I understand the vision. You guys don't want builders and creators to be limited by the chain they pick. You want them to be able to have the advantage of tapping into each respective ecosystem's market share. So with that said, let's say that I am an Ethereum head. I'm an old timer. I want to stay on Ethereum because I love the security of that network. I love the prestige of that network, but I want to be able to make transactions and send transactions over to Solana, over to AVAX. Can I benefit from Ethereum security and all the great things about it, but also pay? Sorry. Also pay transactions on Solana.
Yes, and our real goal is that kind of that whole mindset even goes away. When you go to a website, you don't know if it's hosted by AWS or if it's hosted by Google Cloud, and maybe you can find out, but it doesn't matter to you as the user, and we want that experience for Web3. So you might be an Ethereum maximalist in the future, and that means you store all of your gas tokens in ETH, you store a lot of your treasury in ETH, you only use your ETH wallet. But when you go and you use an application, it almost doesn't matter which blockchain it's stored on for most cases. If you're doing high value transactions or you're staking and betting on a project succeeding, then maybe it matters. But those are technical details. Those aren't things that users should bother themselves with.
Yeah, and then to answer the question specifically about Ethereum security versus the support on Solana, for example, we kind of get the benefit of both worlds there, right? Because we've separated the authority from the state settlement itself, we can allow users on Ethereum to maintain their security, which means that the only way someone could impersonate you, Noah, would be if someone were to compromise the entire Ethereum blockchain. But then the security model of the assets that you're purchasing would be based on wherever they're deployed. So in this case, the assets themselves would have the security model of Solana. And so in that way, we've kind of carved out this in between where you can make sure that you're not compromised, but you have to basically see where the developer has chosen to deploy their application. And those are the characteristics that you get when you interact with it.
And that separation of the authentication security model for the user and the storage or application consensus security model for the developer is really important to our model and really unique to our model. It also allows you to have this system that isn't governed by its weakest link. So in a lot of interoperability solutions, one thing you have to look out for is, does it just inherit the security model of the weakest network connected to it? If you can get into network B, does that compromise network A? And because we have this separation of authentication, that's not true for the spanning network. So you can have a user that authenticates with a private key pair generated from Stitch and their Google account or their Facebook account, and use their Facebook account to go directly buy and own an NFT on Avalanche. And it's probably not a great idea. Facebook accounts get hacked all the time. But if that user's Facebook account gets hacked and their Avalanche NFT gets stolen, your Avalanche NFT in the same project, if you're an Ethereum user, is totally safe. Those domains are really separated, and you don't succumb to the weakest link.
Gentlemen, this is so cool, and it makes me very excited to hear about folks building new solutions to interoperability. I'm curious to know what you think needs to happen for this solution to be something that is mainstream, and also expanding a bit upon that question. Does that mean that popular decentralized applications that we use today will have to integrate Spanning Labs APIs in order to make this vision that you guys have a reality?
Yeah, so we have a couple of thoughts on this as well. So when we designed our spanning address standard, which is the way we can address any user invariant of the chain that they're coming from, we built it in a way that used as many open standards as we could find in the industry. For example, the domain standard we use is based on chainlist.org, which is also what most wallets use today. And the address standard we use is, of course, exactly what you already see in your wallet. And so because of this, we've tried to reduce the amount of specific spanning implementation requirements that are required. And so we've really boiled it down to what we think is the bare essential for your application to even go multi-chain. For any application to be multi-chain, it needs to be able to address its users in a multi-chain way. And we think that's the value of the spanning address scheme. And the benefit of that is, as we continue to see these services grow and we see these multi-home applications grow, we think the amount of integration continues to go down. If you're an application developer today, integrating with the spanning network is actually as easy in many cases as replacing just a single word. For more complex applications, we have a number of guides online on our documentation website that actually walk through how some of these conversions can happen. All in all, to say, we think we've basically created the most minimal diff of changes that need to be made, basically, for an application to go multi-chain, whether that's via our network or not. And so because of that, we feel pretty good that we can continue to encourage adoption for this future.
Yeah. That being said, aside from just the spanning network, we do need more adoption in general of this multi-chain art thinking. We need SushiSwap to be able to recognize multi-chain users from a bunch of different networks. We need different AMMs to be able to point at contracts on other chains. Using our multi-chain addressing standard or not, we do need more support for multi-chain architectures and multi-chain infrastructures in general. So we're working on that as well, and a lot of that is education. The earlier people start to think about making their application multi-chain when they deploy, the easier it will be in the future and the more options they'll have in the future.
Gentlemen, we've touched on multi-home applications several times in the span of this AMA, and I wanted to get a tad bit more technical for our audience. Have you tell us a bit more about spanning delegates and how those work?
Sure. Yeah. So the spanning delegates act as the endpoints for the spanning network, or the APIs for the spanning network. We deploy a spanning delegate, at least one spanning delegate on each network that we support. And that is where a user or a smart contract can go and communicate and make requests across other networks. That delegate on their own network is responsible for verifying who they are and other message header information, like the message sender and the transaction origin, as well as what they want to do. So what is their request? Where are they sending it to? And what's the function call they want to execute, or the general data that they want to pass? Once that delegate on their local network does all of that verification, it sends the request to our relay system. And our relay system can then send that request to the receiving delegate on the destination chain. So on the destination chain, a lot of that verification happens again. And then serving that information out to the applications it's talking to, and the smart contracts it's talking to, also happens. So all of the verified information about a transaction is stored in those delegates for the life of a transaction. And that's another interesting thing about how the protocol works, is it's mostly stateless, or it's stateless outside of a single transaction. For the life cycle of one transaction, we maintain all of that verified information, but then it disappears. So we really try hard not to be a custody agent for custodying value of assets, as well as custodying user data or anything that is essential to making the process work.
And what about the function of blockchain OS? I read that BOS is based on ROS2, which is a robotics operating system. Would you please give our audience members a high-level overview of what all this means?
Yeah, so blockchain OS, or as we call internally BOS, is kind of our relay network that we use to allow messages to go from chain to chain. It's based on ROS2, which is the robotic operating system. And ROS is used in a number of industries, including self-driving cars, where we come from, where it's used to allow different parts of a robot, in that case, to talk to each other and to understand different systems. Blockchain OS acts in a very similar way for blockchains, which allows different chains to be able to understand where they are relative to each other. But I think the easiest way to really think about BOS is that it is the boss. It's in charge of really making sure that messages get from point A to point B, and it is the relay that allows that to happen.
And it comes from, it's ROS2 is really a great piece of technology. It came out in 2004. It was open sourced by Willow Garage, or ROS1 came out in 2004. There's a huge community around it, building on it. It is the standard. If you're going to go build a robot or an autonomous car, you're going to start with ROS. And it has a lot of prestige because of that. It's been formally verified by a number of different very large companies. It is used by the military. And it is designed to be extremely efficient, extremely cheap. And also with ROS2 came the factor of decentralization. ROS2 specifically was designed for decentralized swarm robotics, mostly drones. When you watch the Super Bowl and you see them form the NFL logo over the stadium, they're using ROS2. More than likely using ROS2. So there's a lot of advantages that gives us. There's a huge supporting ecosystem and developer tooling environment, as well as a lot of pedigree that we can rely on for the correct approach to building a system like this.
Very interesting. And Moving on, can you guys explain at a high level what the spanning address standard is and what the function of bytes are?
Yeah, so the spanning address is something that we touched on a little bit earlier, but it basically allows it's a way for a user to be uniquely identified in the entire spanning network. And it's also a mechanism to route messages. And so a spanning address has three general sections. The first section is the domain ID, which is the network you're coming from. So this will be the chain list ID standard that will indicate that you're coming from Ethereum or from Polygon or from another network. Then there's the local address, which is what your address is on that network. So it would be, in this case, Noah's address on Ethereum, for example. And then the final section is what we call the reserved section, and that's really for the protocol itself. So when developers choose to send messages across the spanning network, they often want to clarify certain settings or certain parameters. Things like the number of blocks to wait before a confirmation, retry patterns, and other things like that. We encode those pieces of information directly into the reserved portion of the spanning address, which allows you to only have to send one packet of data rather than sending multiple packets of data back and forth. We think that this is pretty useful because it allows the user to really fully specify everything they want the spanning network to do. And the way we break all of these down is that they're broken down in sections of bytes. So we have a couple of bytes, 20 bytes for a local address. We have a certain number reserved, and then the remaining are left for the delegate itself. And so the bytes are really just a mechanism of how we encode that information.
And all of this is with the goal of giving the developers as much power as we can. And all of the knobs that they want to turn, they're able to turn. So if you are running a game and you need microtransactions, you need those transactions to settle in 200 milliseconds and be extremely cheap. There's certain options you're going to specify in your routing parameters. And you might make some sacrifices in order to do so. So, usually the trade-off when we're talking about blockchains and Web3 is between speed and security. So if you're running microtransactions for your application, you might not care about security because you're talking about fractional cents, but you do care about speed because that user experience is really important. So you'll turn that dial. But on that same application, you might be issuing rewards. So you go and you play a game and I do something great in the game. I want to get a rewarded NFT back to me. And that NFT might have significant value. So now that dial can be turned by the developer on the same platform with the same infrastructure in place, so that now the transaction may take 10 minutes to settle, but it's much more secure because there's a lot more consensus criteria that need to be met.
Gentlemen, from a high level, which proprietary Spanning Labs API extensions are we able to integrate into our projects? And how I read on the doc that this is as easy as a few keystrokes. Can you explain how it all works and why it's so user-friendly?
Yeah, so Drew and I are both developers and we care deeply about the developer experience. And so when we were designing the protocol, we made sure that everything that we were building was backwards and forwards compatible. And so what that means is that today, most developers use the Open Zeppelin standards of various contracts like ERC20 and ERC721. And so when we were building our versions of these contracts, we made sure that we matched a lot of the standards that were already in place. What this means is that if you already have a contract that uses the Open Zeppelin ERC20, if you replace the word Open Zeppelin with the word spanning, your contract is now multi-chain and your token is now multi-chain. And so we really have gotten it down to a couple keystrokes in the best case scenario. The other thing I'd like to point out is that while we have these API extensions, and in many ways they may be considered proprietary, under the hood, they're really not doing too many complicated things. At its core, when you use the Spanning Labs version of a given contract, what it does is it changes the address standard from using 20 bytes, which is the common, to using 32, which allows us to fit a full spanning address into it. In addition, it also sets up a delegate address, which basically is just a way for the application to know where in the spanning network it should talk to. And those are really the two main changes that get brought in as a version of our contracts. But we understand that developers don't always want everything all at once. And so we do have the individual versions of all of these utilities available as well. And so if you want to, you could import the @spanning contract utilities instead, and you could build a more bespoke solution. It's really up to the developer, as Drew mentioned a little bit earlier. We do want to give as many options as they have available, and we want to make sure that we can support someone who just wants to test it out with a single word, while also allowing someone to build the next Facebook.
Yeah, and Pratik touched quickly on backwards compatibility there, so I wanted to dive in a little deeper. But all of these contracts work like normal contracts. So if you're using the spanning ERC20 or the spanning 721 for your NFT project, that NFT project can be bought, sold, traded, minted, part of your game. The same way it can be by any local user. It can be tracked by all the same token trackers. It can be sold on all of the same markets and marketplaces and order books. But you get this additional multi-chain functionality added on top. And having those options for the future and having those options now are really only value adds in our eyes.
So I'm guessing that a lot of these integrations will vary case by case, depending on what the developer is trying to do. Let's say that I myself want to build an app that is capable of reaching users and interacting with other networks, all the great stuff that you guys offer with Spanning Labs. Where do I start? And also, do I need to be an experienced developer? So far, you guys have talked a lot about developer-friendly this and developer-friendly that, but I'm curious to know, someone like me that understands things from a conceptual level and a theoretical level, but doesn't necessarily have coding experience, am I able to get involved?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, 100%. The best place to start to learn more about the protocol and also the ins and outs is visiting docs.spanning.network, where we have a number of API references, tutorials, and guides that kind of explain how everything works. And the other thing I'd like to call out is, because of how we've designed our system, in many ways, you don't even need to know the application is multi-chain. Replacing message sender with spanning message sender and transaction origin with spanning transaction origin basically allows your app to treat remote users and local users in the exact same way. And we think this is pretty powerful because ideally you don't have to have the overhead in your mind about the specifics of the complexity of how to route over BOSS versus how to do X versus how to do Y. You want to focus more specifically on your application and allow the multi-chain abstraction to do its job. And that's really where we've spent our time as well, to make sure that you really can focus on building your application instead of having to fiddle with the complexities of a cross-platform relay.
And we'll have a lot more tutorials coming out over the next week, actually, and then even more beyond that. But aiming to make them all beginning developer friendly. So if you need to set up your environment and install Solidity and your first NPM packages, we'll hopefully be able to walk you through that as well.
The reference section of your documents does a very thorough job of breaking down each component of your API. And I'm going to go ahead and guess that the future documents and future tutorials that you put out will do the same job at breaking it down for people of all, I guess, readers of all experience levels. Have you guys thought about building out video tutorials and even making a YouTube channel for those people like myself who are visual learners?
Yes, definitely. And we'll be posting our first set tutorial later today, actually. It does not have a video attached to it yet, but I think someone on our team is actively writing the script to go through that tutorial and make that video as we're meeting now. So hopefully we'll have that within the week, or start to have that within the week.
Yeah, and I think as time goes on, we will have more and more different mediums of explaining our various concepts, whether that's through code tutorials, videos, demo applications, you name it.
Yeah. And one thing we also want to do is build a community. So, the best people to answer your questions and help you through tricky bugs will be us when we're around. But, we're 6 people full time. We won't be around 24/7 in all time zones. But hopefully our community will. So if you're interested in becoming part of that community, getting answers to some Stack Overflow questions out there, we would love for you to join our Discord and share with us what you're excited to build.
Gentlemen, I couldn't wrap my head around the test coverage section of your doc. Would you please just very briefly explain that?
Yeah, so this comes a little bit as a background from our background in self-driving cars, but typically as you build complex systems, one of the things you want to do is make sure that you're writing good tests to test all of the potential edge cases or common flows. This is a pretty standard software practice, and we thought that because we're so early, and as you said, we're still not quite at the maturity level yet, we wanted to showcase the testing that we've already done and the coverage that we have over our existing contracts today as a way to show the community how seriously we're taking this problem for validation and for testing. We think that it's going to be essential moving forward. And while we do plan on also getting third-party audits, we think that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and we're not afraid of that. And so for lack of a better phrase, we're just putting our money where our mouth is, and we're letting people see exactly how our network is built and how it's tested.
Yeah, and that actually speaks to a few of the modules that we have exposed on that documentation page. So that's auto-generated from our code base. When we push an update to our code base, those coverage numbers get updated. And you can see if we've introduced something new or if we've added more test coverage, which will also be coming this week. But there are a few other things. You mentioned the references guides. Those are all directly auto-generated from our open source NPM package. So, that is the code you're looking at. It's not just an explanation of the code. You're looking at the actual code and the actual function definitions and really glaring in and getting all of the nitty-gritty details that we can give you. One thing that I'm really excited that we were able to expose is the metrics page. So that metrics page opens, has a few iframe portals to our Grafana server, which shows the live metrics of the health of our network. And you can go to that page and you can see very clearly, is the network up or down? And I see Pratik has it pulled up. It's up right now, which is great. But also the health of each node and network that we use and the node providers that we use. So every every network that we support, we're aiming before we expose it to the public to have multiple node providers so that there's a lot of redundancy. If Anchor goes down for 30 minutes, we want to make sure that our network stays up and stays healthy. So you can check those statuses there, as well as plug into them directly. So if you're building your application and you want to make sure that if our network goes down, your users don't send any cross-chain requests, you can do that. And we have the code right on that page that you can plug into your website to make sure that you have that guard in place.
Drew, Pratik, how long has the spanning network testnet been available? Which chains are currently supported? And also, when can we expect the mainnet?
Yeah, so the testnet itself has been live for about 7 months. It hasn't been super public for those 7 months. So it's been public on these public chains, and anyone could have used it if they went and they found the contracts and they figured out the ABIs. But we've only released all of that information very recently, last week, because we've been testing, validating. It's super important to us that the systems we put out are enterprise grade and they're robust. And if you're building your application on our infrastructure, it has to support your application till the end of time, and you have to be able to sleep at night and without any worries. So we're really focused on making everything we put into the world bulletproof, and that gets into the timelines for mainnet. So we've gotten to this point. We've validated a lot for testnet, but one thing we haven't validated are the unknowns. What are people going to do on this network that we haven't thought of? And are we sufficiently protected from the things we haven't thought of? So we're going to let the testnet run for a couple of months and really ask people to go and try and break it and build crazy things and push it to its limits so that we can verify and feel confident that everything works as expected before we go to mainnets. We're currently hoping to go to mainnets with a couple of white glove partners in more of a permissioned way in Q4 of this year, and then opening it up to the general public in a non-permissioned way in early 2023.
Gentlemen, we're running short on time here, but there are a couple questions I really want to get to. I'm going to try to bundle them together. So who would you say some of your major competitors in this space are? How far along are they in solving similar issues of interoperability that you guys are trying to tackle? And most importantly, what are the distinguishing features of your approach versus the protocols that are trying to, again, make similar or solve similar problems in the space?
Yeah, I think the most distinguishing characteristic about our network versus our competitors is really how we think about ownership bridging itself. Really the concept of moving around users rather than moving around assets or code. We think that this approach has a pretty strong advantage, as we covered a little bit earlier, regarding the risks about honeypot attacks, the security model, the separation between authorization and state settlement, that you just can't replicate with the existing architectures that we see in other bridges. I think because of that, it allows us to move a little bit more quickly. And I think the security model not being reliant on the weakest link allows us to also move faster when adding new networks. And we think that both of those things will be pretty valuable as we continue to see more competition and more interest in the space. Because at the end of the day, I think everyone is looking forward to a future where we can have multi-home applications and we can have services that talk to each other and interact in a more seamless way. And I think the spanning approach is really the way to get us across that finish line.
Right. We see a lot of competitors in the space today that are pretty far along, that have the same vision of the world. They want that application to be able to deploy once and a user anywhere else to seamlessly use it without knowing they're using a multi-chain application. And you asked for names, we won't shy away from it. There's Layer 0, Axelar, Socket, Wormhole. These are all projects that share that same vision of the world, but are approaching it very differently. Each one of those projects has gone out and built an asset bridge. And asset bridges do have their use cases. They work well for DeFi, where people are comfortable with derivative assets and modeling out the risk of a loan. They don't always model it correctly, but it's something that's understood at least. But when you get into these more utility projects with unique functionality, like games or NFT projects, where you can't just simply copy and paste the code and expect the same value, that's where the asset bridging model really starts to break down, and our focus on ownership bridging really starts to shine.
Pratik, Drew, I think this is a great spot to close out the AMA. It was a pleasure meeting you both in New York City. I'm glad that we were able to work out a scenario where you both came onto our podium and spoke to our community. So I want to thank you again for your time, and I wish you guys all the best in solving these issues of interoperability in the still very young crypto industry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Noah. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you for having us. And there will always be more info at spanninglabs.com.
Right on. And audience members, we were going to post all of their socials in the main chat. So definitely go and join their Discord, engage with their community members, engage with their admins and the founders. They're all very transparent. Remember that everything you hear on Whale Coin Talk is for educational purposes only. We don't give any financial advice here. We are a platform for you to come and learn about various crypto projects that are being built across the space. So my name is Noah. Thank you again for joining us, and take care. We'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.